So with the competition finally over, I could start releasing some content now. So apparently all the builds were supposed to be kind of kept secret and just within the build groups until the competition was done. So those teasers I've been posting on Instagram, I wasn't supposed to do that. Oops. So with that out of the way, let's get on to the build. Starting off, we're going to take a look at this grill. You guys know how much I hate molded in mesh. So I set out to start whittling all that away. I thought it'd be nice and quick, just scraping it with a razor blade here. After about an hour, I was getting nowhere, and my hand was starting to hurt from holding this thing, so I switched over to the sanding sticks. It took about another hour. Honestly, if I'd known, I would have just busted out the rotary tool to start. So I'm going to sand down just enough to where I could see some daylight through the slats there, because I still want some material in the grill. Otherwise it's going to be too thin and weak. That's a good and a bad thing, because the thinner parts are really weak. I could just punch those out with a toothpick. This is really kind of one of those things where if you sand for 1 second longer than you're supposed to, you just ruin this piece. So go slow, really slow. So if you take your time and do not try to rush it, eventually you'll have something that looks like this. Now I peeked ahead at the instructions, so I know that we could glue this front clip on ahead of time. So I'm going to glue it on now, but we got a problem. The bumper is wider than the body. It does not sit flush. I need to find a way to push that out just a tiny tad bit so everything sits flush. Here's what I came up with. I'm just going to take a chunk of the styrene from the sprue, you know, the flat parts that got all the numbers and sometimes some letters on it. Yeah, just cut that piece right off. Yeah, that's going to work just fine. So I'm just going to take this little bitty piece I cut off and I'm going to glue it to the inside edge of that bumper there. Then I am going to let that dry completely overnight because I want it to be good and strong. In the meantime though, I'm going to do my best to not bump that piece out of place, and I am going to address another problem. That opening in the lower grill, it is supposed to be smooth, but for some reason Revell decided to put kind of a body line or panel gap, whatever you want to call it there. So I'm going to do like I always do when it comes to plugging some holes. Giggity. I'm just going to fill it with some super glue and sand it back flush. So those tabs I glued in had plenty of time to dry. They're good and strong, so let's put them to use. So I glued this guy in place, and we could see that these tabs are doing their job. They are pushing the body out just wide enough to be flush with the front bumper. Now that I know this body is going to work for the vision I have for it, we can move on to the step 1 stuff, and that is removing the body lines. Now normally I do not use a marker to guide myself, however, there are several sinks and low spots all over this body. Once I start sanding on this thing and we take that sheen off, all the imperfections are no longer going to distort the way the light hits it, and they're going to be a lot harder to notice. So that is why I'm using this marker trick. And I don't really like doing this because unless you sand it all completely off or clean it 100%, it can show through the paint. I learned that lesson a long time ago on a white body with a black Sharpie. So I'm hoping this orange Sharpie that's about to die will still be mellow enough to not cause any problems. I don't know. If this method works for you, that's awesome. I know a lot of guys that do use it. For me, I just always go until I can no longer fill that mold seam with my fingernail. then I know it's going to hide under some paint and it's going to be just fine. So as I was going around, I was doing my best to kind of get real heavy on the spots that looked low to me. So let's get to sanding and see how I did. Yeah, that's kind of pretty bad there, Revell. Luckily though, this part of the panel is flat, so I can just go with something with a hard backing to it and just hog it away. The rear quarter panel, however, well, it's got a radius to it. So I gotta use a little flimsy piece of sandpaper and then just take my time. Don't want to distort this body line. Alrighty, so let's see where I'm at here. All of the orange you guys are seeing, these are the low spots that will need attention. The next thing we need to address is that this car, unlike the RTs and the SRTs, it does not have that rear spoiler thing. Revell, in their great wisdom, decided to give us some huge locating tabs for that tiny piece. So you guys, nobody, stop rubbing your cat face on my phone. I am trying to work here. If I need this to take off and make us millions of dollars, you gotta stop interrupting me while I'm in the studio recording. Sorry about that. Where was I? Oh yeah, once you get enough super glue in that hole, you could just sand it back flush. Then once you get a layer of paint on it, nobody will know it was there. Watch this. I'll show you what I'm talking about. That is silky smooth right there. Alrighty, so just like the front bumper, Revell gave us some weird body lines on the rear bumper too for absolutely no reason. You guys know how it works by now. Super glue, sand it smooth, paint over it. Oh, I guess I left this part in. For some reason I thought I cut this out to save time. So since I just explained what I'm doing, I will just apologize for my fingernails. This was mid-April, somewhere in there. So I just dug my mower out of storage and gave it its spring tune-up, and that thing was nasty. I didn't care about it last year, apparently. So once I get this guy popped in here for some test fitting, we could see that it has the plague that the front bumper had as well. The body is also too narrow back here to sit flush with the bumper. One side's decent, but I can't get that lucky, I guess. So some more tabs to the rescue. Now back here it is extremely important because this piece gets installed last. It's what holds the chassis in place to the body. So yeah, we get to deal with this now so everything works and lines up later. Now the top piece here, that is a little bit saggy. It's really thin, but once I get the rear light bar in place, that thing's going to fit like it's supposed to. So all the body work is finally out of the way so we can move on to our paint. As I mentioned in part 2, this Tamiya white, this X2, this is an almost perfect match for the PW7 paint code that Chrysler used for all of its white vehicles. I'm starting to see that it is extremely difficult to see white paint going over white primer. So I am going to spare you guys the subsequent coats, and I'm just going to cut it off here. It is that time of the year where my basement does its annual flooding. So let's use that to our advantage here. Yeah, I'm going to use it to wet all my decals. This is my first time using any decals from Slicks, so I'm going to do some testing with their logo here, because I want to know how it reacts to this really super hot 2K paint I use and all my decal chemicals. Guys, I gotta tell you, so far I am super impressed. These things, for being as thin as they are still super resilient, unlike some other decals. To me. Now they do note that this stuff will work just fine with microset and microsol. Problem is, I am running low on that. I do, however, have plenty of this Tamiya Mark Fit. Now it's probably not a good test, since all I have are these two tiny little slivers of some decal up there to test them on. If I was thinking ahead, I would have cut that logo in half and done half of it just with some raw 2K clear, the other half with this Tamiya Mark Fit, then some 2K clear over it. Ultimately though, it all worked out just fine. This is all some amazing products, they mesh well together, so let's move on to laying out these decals. And I'll be honest, I don't really know which is which here, so I'm going to measure these, and whichever one is the wider one, that's the one I'm going to put on the hood. But these are the same size, so it doesn't matter which one goes where. Now there are really no instructions here, just reference photos from the internet. So I'm just going to kind of eyeball it, get it centered, and once I'm happy with where it's at, I'm going to hit it with a little bit of heat to kind of lock it in place so it's not moving around when I squeegee all the moisture out from under it with a Q-tip. So in a nutshell, that is the process for decals. Now just apply that to every other decal on this body. Now oddly enough, for a race car, this livery, it did not have a whole lot of decals. I mean, all up from letting them soak, laying them out, hitting them with a bit of heat, smoothing them out, then hitting them with all the decal solution. All up, it took about 40 minutes for the entire car. Alright, I'm gonna jump in here and just apologize. With my basement flooding, there is a ton of moisture and humidity in the air. So I drug all my airbrush upstairs, and I painted this in the garage, and it just didn't occur to me to take any recording equipment. To make up for that lost content though, I'm gonna include the engine build in this segment as well. Now, if you guys remember, this is a kit bash of sorts. This engine came out of Revell's SRT 10 Viper. And assembly is just like any other engine. You got your two halves, glue them together, then just add your various parts. And I don't know what Revell was smoking that day, but not a single one of these lined up. Everything was warped, so I had to do a whole lot of cleanup. And remember, the idea here is to not remove material, just make everything flat so things fit flush with each other. Now the heads and the oil pan, they're all the same aluminium color, so we might as well glue them all in place now. Just make painting that much easier. Now the Dragpack V10, it is quite a bit different than what one gets in the Viper. Starting off with this intake manifold right here. It is one massive intake plenum compared to the dual ram that the Vipers use. Now, even though I have a 3D printer, I do not know how to 3D model, so I'm just going to modify the kit piece. And I'm going to start by using a chunk of masking tape to create a dam of sorts, because we have to fill that huge gap. Now if you guys know how I plan to do that, go ahead and give this video a like, because I am too predictable. Seriously though guys, use super glue instead of putty. It will not shrink, it sands out nice and smooth, and paint has no problem sticking to it. The only downside to it is that once it starts to set up, a chemical reaction makes it extremely hot, so you got to go kind of in layers. This is 4 or 5 different layers here to get that gap filled. However, with that CA accelerator, this only took about 2 minutes. How long does it take for putty to dry? Now, if you guys do this, just be sure to bend your sanding stick, because the top of this is not flat. It still has a contour to it. Well, let's peel this tape off and see how I did. Yeah, the very back of this is under the cowl, and that's not too ugly. I could live with this. On to the next modification. If you guys remember in part 2, we are not using the 6-speed transmission. We are using a power glide, because that's what the drag pack came with. Just like in part 2, I'm going to saw this transmission off, only this time I am going to take my time. Yes, it is super smooth. We still have the flange for the starter. We got just enough meat there to simulate a bell housing. So now we can move on to paint. I'm just going to real quickly paint this oil filter white, then I'm going to mask it off, and I'm just going to paint everything engine related in the aluminium color. Now the dude I bought this from, I have no idea what he painted these valve covers with, but I cannot get that paint to strip off of it. And I got some pretty aggressive chemicals, but I'm at the point where I'm afraid he's just going to dissolve the plastic. So I'm just going to prime over it and paint it in the shade of red that it needs to be. Now unfortunately, with so many coats of paint on these, it really drowned out the Viper lettering. Which means there is not a whole lot of material there for me to do any detail painting with, so I am just going to use these kit decals. Now for the headers, they're molded in, like, Noobies, why are you back? You're a cat, dude. What do you want? No, stop that. Get away from my phone. The collectors on these headers on the truck, they're contoured because they tuck up in real close to the transmission. I filled all that in because I cut the flange off and then I drilled them out to make them look a little bit more realistic, and I couldn't have done that with the way that Revell originally cast them. Now in a real car, these things are stainless steel, so what I did is I painted them in just any random shade of silver I found in the collection, just whatever was at front. I don't remember what it was. But stainless steel, it tends to tarnish when it gets too hot, and it turns all different shades, ranging from rose gold all the way up to bright blue. All the reference photos I've seen, they have a gold tint to them, so I just mixed up a little bit of gold and I'm holding the airbrush back about a foot and then just letting it mist over it. Once all that paint is dry, I can just go in and I'm going to paint the inside of the collector's flat black. That's going to simulate all the soot and carbon, all that nasty stuff inside your exhaust. Finally, with all the paint done, we can move on to putting this thing together. And I did not think that far ahead on this, otherwise I would have spent a lot of time originally lining it up and doing some pins. But now I'm just going to kind of eyeball this, make sure that the trans pan and the oil pan are just looking flush and parallel with each other. Then I'm going to glue it in place. Now this is where I'm going to kind of deviate from the drag pack, because here, instead of power steering, it had a vacuum pump here. I don't have a vacuum pump, so this one's going to have power steering. It is one of one drag packs with power steering. Super rare. Now the headers, being that they're not designed for this kit, they kind of fought me, so I glued them in off camera because I really needed to see what I was doing. Other than that though, this thing is done. For those of you that do follow me on Instagram, I got me one of them wooden pallets like all the cool kids to show off my parts. We are at the end. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Have a good night.